So are you looking for some new techniques for using with your Pan Pastels? Today I want to show you how you can use Watermark ink with your Pan Pastels. This is a way you can create a lot of really beautiful, interesting texture on your art journal pages and your other projects. So if we haven't met yet, my name is Nadine and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So let's get started. So the stamp pads that I'm going to be using today are the Frost & Champagne Versamark Dazzle Watermark stamp pads. You can really use any sort of watermark ink for this. I happened to buy these ones maybe about 10 years ago. I got reinkers for them. So I'm probably gonna have these probably for another 20 years, which is why I'm using this particular brand. Really any brand of watermark ink will work for this technique. And today we're gonna be working on black, and I'm also gonna add some focal images on white. So you can see the difference between using them on black and white and the different things you can get with your Pan Pastels using this technique. So I have the two different stamp pads. One is Frost and one is Champagne. And really it's just the color of the watermark ink. When we're working on black, I would suggest using the Frost. And the reason for that is because it's going to have a slightly different tint to it. You'll be able to see what you add to your surface a little bit better. So I'm just basically just adding some watermark ink to my stamp. I'm using just a large musical stamp from Gina K Designs. It's very difficult to see. You can see it just very slightly if I move the page. The reason I'm using the Frost one is I'd have even less ability to see it using just the champagne color. You can also choose whether or not you want to do a first stamping or just a second value on this by just putting it again onto your surface. It really depends on what you're looking for. And you might notice I am not stamping all the way to the edges. Instead, I'm just stamping to the center of the stamp pad. That way too, I'll have some uneven edges. I'm not gonna have a really strong edge in the middle of my project, which is another thing you wanna avoid if possible. And then I have some of my Tim Holtz flourishes. I have this flourish one that I've had, I don't know, for probably like 10, 15 years. This is a really old stamp pad, but you can still get it because it's been quite popular for a very long time. And this step, you're not going to be able to really see what you're doing. You can maybe angle it a little bit, look down at kind of the surface, and you might be able to see a little bit of what you've added, but it's going to be a little bit difficult to see. So you just kind of have to go by feel on this. And we're looking for random patterns, so it's okay that it's not perfect. If you're a person who loves perfect, this may not be the right technique for you if you really want to make sure everything is perfectly angled. But I think there's some real freedom in just trying things and kind of seeing how it looks. And so now I'm gonna add in a little bit of cursive writing as well. I have another one. This is from the Faded Type stamp set from Tim Holtz. And I really like this one for just adding in a little bit of text to my background. I'm just creating a really simple background here. And it doesn't have to be anything super elaborate or really complex. It's just a nice way of adding texture because we want to create a beautiful texture background, and then I'm going to add other layers on top. So I've lost a little bit of track on where I put my images on, but that's totally okay. I'm really comfortable with the idea of this being a little less perfect. So when you work on black with this technique, go with some lighter colors. I'm actually going to go with my white coarse medium. So this is actually a sparkle medium, and I'm just going to add it to the page. And so this is where the magic happens. You can see all of that design start showing through, and you can see this how beautiful it looks. So it's almost like you've added all the stamping and then you basically reveal an absolutely stunning image. And so you can do the whole surface in this, or you can pick up another color. For this, I'm just using a makeup sponge. You can use soft tools. I've also used a lot of these kind of makeup brushes and these blending tools that work really well for Pan Pastels as well. So really it's any tool that you have on hand. And so that's what the silver. So again, it's a little bit of a different feel than the coarse medium. And now I'm going to go in with a little bit of blue. And so that blue is a fairly light blue. It's not going to have as much shine as what we have with those white and silver colors. And so sometimes what I like to do is just add in an entire layer of the white. You can even go for straight white with this. If I wanted to go for straight white, you can add the straight white in there. But I really like the shine that you get from adding in the mediums. And you might go, well, you've added a bunch of stuff. You've kind of marred your background. But we're not done yet. I am going to show you how you can end up having a lot more contrast when we're all said and done with adding in this first layer. So I'm just going to add in an entire layer of that coarse medium because I really like how that looks. And now I'm going to go in and just add some blue on top in some areas. But this is where maybe I would stick with more of that whole black and white feel. It just depends on where you want to go with color. So you might look at this black background and go, wow, that's really messy. You have color, but you've really lost a lot of that really cool black background. That's where you come in with just a piece of paper towel and you start rubbing. And now what you're running into is, some areas you'll get maybe a little bit of leftover residue. A lot of that residue will come off. So instead what you run into is you have this really gorgeous background that you've now created. And I added a lot of pattern, which is why it's as busy as it is. You could have maybe just left the musical notes and a couple cursive patterns, and that could have been enough. And so what I noticed about how I've applied this is that I did not get a lot along this edge here. Go back in with a little bit of the frost. If you miss a spot, it's not a big issue. We can go back and we can fix things. So I'm just gonna add that in more to the edge. And this is actually where I'm gonna take it off the stamp pad. Sometimes stamp pads actually kind of get in the way. And in this case, you can actually take the musical notes and do it just along the edge, because what's nice about that is now this edge lines up with that edge of your page, so you don't have to worry about going over. So now we're gonna add in a little bit more of that white medium. And now look at that. Now we have a really balanced page instead of having a spot where it basically disappears. So part of the reason this works to basically just be able to rub it off is basically the Watermark ink is picking up all of that color and it's basically setting it in place. And that means that anything that's not on that Watermark ink is going to rub off. And that's why you can get such a beautiful texture and color just by adding in a little bit of Watermark ink. But then we can take this a little bit further. We can also use stencils with this. And with this one, I'm going to use the Frost Watermark ink pad and basically a foam. Why I like using the foam for this is it makes sure that I get in there really, really well. Helps me make sure I have a really good pattern in there. And this is where I usually try to find a pattern that is a little bit bigger than what I've already added to my background. Because if you have too much fine texture on fine texture, sometimes you can lose some of the effect that you're going for. And this is a Rebecca Bear stencil that I haven't used in a really long time, actually. So I thought today was the day to pull it out and have some fun with it. And again, sometimes you're not always going to get perfect images. You just kind of have to trust the process and think through a little bit about where you want your images before adding in your color. And I mostly wanted those brick areas. Gonna add in just a little bit more color. And this is where you need to try to pay a little bit of attention to where you put your color, but if you haven't, don't worry too much about it. The Watermark ink only absorbs so much, so we should be able to keep a little bit more contrast going on this page. And so I'm just adding in a little bit of the blue, and you can see now I'm running into having a lot of really beautiful blue texture on top of what I've already added. And if you really wanted to make sure that all of this is separate, you could have sealed the Pan Pastel before adding in this next layer. I didn't, because I just wanted to see where I could get this and where I could take this. Now I'm just kind of searching for my next area of color. Because it's there. I just kind of have to find it. And how deep it is depends on how much Watermark ink. You can see in this area here, I had quite a bit of Watermark ink, so I'm getting quite a bit of color that's sticking to it. Some of these other areas, I didn't add quite as much. Also, you can go on with a little bit more of the Pan Pastel just to help that really pull out from the background as well. It's gonna come in with some green as well. And just mix it up. And this is where you can have fun, where you just start with a layer of white and then you start adding in these other colors just to see what kind of effect you can get and the different types of layers you can create by blending. And this is where if you even did a larger image, I kept it still to a more fine image, but if you had a very contrasting large image that had a lot less detail in it, it would also stick out a lot more. So it also depends on if you want subtle layers, if you want to go crazy with the amount of color and texture that you want to add to this. So now we've added our Pan Pastels, and now I'm wiping it. We're bringing that black back in. And if you've enjoyed what you've seen so far, if you could just like this video, that just helps other people see it and helps small channels like me. So thank you so much for your support. So do we need to seal this? At this point, we don't really need to seal this because of the fact that we've used Watermark ink. which basically will absorb the pan pastel, hold it in place. When I rub my hand against it, I'm not picking up color. Usually if you were doing this without a watermark ink, if you ran your hand across this, you'd be picking up lots of color. You would need to seal it. So now let's work on our focal images. You could stamp any sort of image for this. You could use pan pastel paper. You could also use watercolor paper. I'm actually using Canson watercolor paper for this project, and I do have the type of paper I use in the description below. You just need something that has just a little bit of grab to help the paper grab the color from the pan pastels. So I sometimes use pan pastel paper. I like also using watercolor paper for this. And so what I've done is just taken a few of my own original pieces of artwork and just added them to this. I've also done this with stamps before. You can really use any stamped image you have. Just use a permanent ink like pigment ink or archival ink just to seal it to your page. We're not going to be using a lot of water, but I do like that vibrancy that those particular inks do provide. So I just want to add in a little bit of texture to these before I start adding in some blending. And so I wanted to use slightly different patterns than what I used in the background. And it might be very hard to see. You might be able to see it very slightly. It's really hard to see, honestly. And so basically you're just adding in a little bit of texture to these images just to add a little something to this page. And I'm doing both first and second values on this. And now I'm going to move to a little bit of text. I decided to move away from just the cursive, and I'm using a different text that was from that faded type stamp collection from Tim Holtz. And I do like Tim Holtz for some of his good quality rubber stamps, especially some of the type ones, just because I find them very versatile and I use them a lot of different ways in my creative projects. So I'm just going to add in a little bit of stamping here as well, using both first and second values. We'll be eventually cutting out these images, so it doesn't matter that you're way past the edges on them. You basically just want to be able to get the stamping down. And I'm not sure how well I got some stamping on this one, so I'm going to go back in and just add in a couple more areas just to make sure I have some texture there. So I really wanted to showcase how the Watermark ink works on these images. So now we want to come in with a little bit of our pan pastels. And we'll just start with the Peony image here. And I'll be using a few different ones for this. This one here is actually called a colorless blender. This is one that I use when I want to try to get a really smooth blend on white. This one's actually just white, and this one's metallic medium. So if you notice me using white, there is a reason I'm using that particular one, because it's actually not white, it's a colorless blender. And so I'm going to show you how to use them with this type of brush. I have the link for these ones below. I got these ones off of Amazon, but you can also find some other ones that are also available at local craft stores. And so I'm going to start with a little bit of the colorless blender. It's hard to see, there's a little bit there in my brush, and then I'm going to add in a little bit of the pink. So you just basically tap the top for both, and you just add it in there. And so what you're seeing is now you're getting that color coming through on your surface. And what the colorless blender is beautiful for is it just helps extend that color, where that magenta that I have is quite bright. So by using a little bit of the colorless blender, that helps you not only get a much smoother finish to it, but you also have the ability to control it a little bit better, to have that be a little bit smoother, to go a little bit further and go a little bit lighter. Because what I wanted to do with this one is not to have super dark on dark images. I wanted to be able to work them together. So by using the colorless blender, that just goes a really long way to get those beautiful colors in there. And you're getting all that fun texture as well. So that's part of the reason I wanted to stamp on the white, to show that you don't have to only do it on black. You can do it on white as well. It just gives a different feel, a different look to it. And in this case, I'm not actually going to take a paper towel and wipe it away, because it would end up wiping away some of the color. Let's say you went too dark. Let's say you had an area like that and you were like, I'm really unhappy with that. That's where you can come in and just remove it that way. Where you can also use an eraser for this. If you hate this, if you're like, this is not what I was going for, take an eraser. And it's not going to remove anything from the Watermark ink, but any areas that maybe you added too much color in the background, it is going to lighten up. This isn't going to work quite as well as it does when you're using just regular pan pastels on paper. But if you didn't realize that you could erase pan pastels, you totally can. And I'm going to do the same thing to this leaf. And come in with a little bit of the colorless blender, because I want to try to have a very smooth blend to start off with. I don't want a lot of harsh lines. I don't want to have a lot of issues, which is why I am starting with the colorless blender. And I do want to keep the color quite light just to start. I'm going to continue to add layers and build layers as I go. But I just really want to show you what you can do with this in just the first layer. I like adding in some of those stamped images. I just think it adds some fun texture. It's also a little bit more forgiving if you're newer to Pan Pastels, because then if you don't have a perfect blend, it's like, oh, my blend isn't perfect. Instead, it's like, well, look at all this cool texture I've added in, and look how great that looks. And that for me goes a long way for creating something that's really fun and really different. So before we add in a lot more layers, I want to show you how you can seal with Pan Pastels. So I'm going to be using SpectraFix. I only have the concentrate. I find that's what I can usually find here in Calgary. But all that is basically it requires me to measure out some of the fixative. It has the measurements on the side, and I mix it with vodka. And that's a way that I basically get the mix that I want here. And basically you want to give it a good shake just to make sure that you have that fully mixed. I'm just using an old optical spray container. I find the ones that you use for makeup or for optical spray work the best. I find these reused bottles almost work better than things I can find on Amazon or other places, just because of the fact that they are designed to work really well with a product. And I just find that they just usually work better for art than almost anything else. So I want to give this a good spray. Just so you're aware, this SpectraFix does have casein. So if you're like me and you have dairy allergies, wear a mask. I do find that I try not to inhale it when I spray it, and I usually leave the room for a few minutes afterwards until it's set. And that's just a way that I can kind of keep my casein allergy underneath control, but just something to be aware of. It generally doesn't have much scent, but I just find that because I am quite sensitive to dairy, it just is something to be aware of. So I'm just gonna give this a good shake, and then I'm just gonna spritz the entire page. And when I'm spritzing, I'm putting in a fairly liberal layer of this. It's going to bend the paper a little bit, and that's part of the reason I like using the watercolor paper, just because it does bend a little bit, but it's not going to curl completely in half. And so I'm just going to basically leave this for a few minutes and let it fully dry, and then I'm going to add in another layer. So now that we've sealed this with SpectraFix, it's sealed, but it looks beautiful. Even though we have quite a bit of SpectraFix, the color's really consistent. It doesn't fade, it doesn't darken too much. The SpectraFix is definitely my favorite fixative for Pan Pastels. So we could leave it like this if you just wanted to keep it very basic, but I wanted to add in some details, add in some different colors. And this is where these fun little makeup brushes that also can be used for ink blending or Pan Pastels come in really handy. And so now these, because of the size of these tips, you have really fine ones, which lets you get into all those small spaces that maybe you would have trouble being able to add in that detail with a sponge. And so I'm just going to go in just with a little bit of just the straight magenta. I'm going to add a little bit to the bottom of these petals. And you can decide how much of a beautiful blend you want, if you want more of a dramatic blend. It really is up to you. And I'm looking at this going that the center is going to be a little bit darker. The edges are going to be a little bit lighter. And then I'm going to have areas along the edge here that maybe I'll just go in with a little bit of the pearl, maybe even just a little bit of the white and the pearl together, just to lighten them up a little bit. So I like the idea of being able to add in some shine to places. Go back in with that magenta, continue to layer and play around with this. And so you could go pretty crazy with this. I'm going to continue on and just add in as many layers until I feel like I'm really happy with how this looks. And you might find if you pull up a little bit too much, you're going to get these little grainy bits, and all you need to do is blow them off a little bit and then just keep working. Okay, and this is also where you can come with some colorless blender. Like here, I'm just adding a little bit of colorless blender to the edges, just so that I have a little bit more of a smoother blend in there. Find it's too dark, you can always come in with a little bit of white, mix it with that magenta, add in a little bit of that coarse medium as well too. The mediums are kind of neat because you can use them on almost anything. Mediums are white or black. You can also get into metallics, and the metallics are basically the shimmer in a particular color. But I like being able to use the mediums. It just allows me to use them with any color, and I don't need to have a whole bunch of extra Pan Pastels for that. So I do have a nice collection, but I don't have all the colors, far from it. There are so many colors that you can get. I'm okay with just using a few colors and just getting some other mediums and other things just to help them work a little bit harder for me, just so that I can continue to use them on a variety of projects. I think I've changed my mind. I think I want these outer petals to be darker. And I think about where I want my light to hit. And I think what I actually want to do is go a bit lighter with these centers. So I'm just pulling that back a little bit by just using my kneadable eraser. Just have the outer edges be a little bit darker. I think I like that a little bit better. And this is the beauty of Pan Pastels, is if you don't like things, just basically use your kneaded eraser. It just pulls up that Pan Pastel color, and then you can basically just fix it and move on with another color. At any point you want to use a different color on the same brush, just wipe it off on your paper towel, and then pick up the next color you want to use. With this particular peony, I'm having to choose a color combination because basically this peony was white with a little bit of red in the center, and I wanted to have a bit more color in it than what my actual picture shows. So that's why I'm having to kind of make a decision about which direction I want this color to go. In this area, I'm just basically grabbing the colorless blender and I'm blending it out a little bit. So there's a little less of a harsh line there. And I've also decided just to add in little bits of purple in places because I like the idea of it having more than one color. Or I can just come with the colorless blender and just use the bigger brush. You'll see that blends it out a little bit smoother than what I would be getting otherwise. I'm just using a slightly bigger brush just to add in a little bit more white. I'm trying not to get this too dark. That's my biggest problem with Pan Pastel sometimes, is I end up going a little too mid-tone with things and then I don't have quite enough contrast. So I'm trying to make sure I bring it back some of that contrast and just keep adding a little bit more variety in my colors. So come to the center with a little bit of yellow here. Peony center is usually pretty yellow, and the center bits here are usually a little bit of yellow here, but they also have like a tiny bit of green in them. So I'm just going to bring in a little bit of this green. Just blend that a little bit more. Back in with a little bit of that more cad yellow. I'm going to spray this in another room just so that I don't inhale as much of the fumes, and then I will move on to our leaves. The leaves, I'm going to keep it a little bit more simplistic. I'm just going to come in with a little bit of the bright yellow green for the centers. I'm using a bigger brush here. I'm not going super crazy with too many layers with this. So with the blending, you can start with a mid-tone, you can start with light tones and move darker. There's lots of options. And again, that colorless blender also opens up a few more options as well. So I'm using this bright yellow green on top of the phthalo green just to add a little bit more brightness to some of these leaves. Generally, the peony leaves are darker. I'm going to go a little bit lighter for this particular page just because we're working with such a dark background. I don't want it to get completely lost by doing them a glossy green like they usually are. But I will add in some darker areas as well. But I'm just trying to stick a little bit more with trying to find a little bit more variation in colors in this project over getting perfect realistic color. I'm going to come into some of these areas with a little bit of that darker green, add a little bit of color in there, but again, not trying to go too dark. So what I love about the Pan Pastels is they're super blendable, and especially if you have a set of ink blending tools like this, it even makes it easier. And what I find with a lot of my ink blending tools is I wipe them off, I wash them if necessary, then I use them with Pan Pastels and I wash them, and that's my way of making sure I don't need to own too many tools. Instead, I just keep them well cleaned, and then I don't have to worry about having 16 sets of brushes. Instead, I have one and they have multiple uses. And especially if you're on a budget, you want to try to find yourself some tools that work with lots of different mediums and will work on more than one application. So I just find that these tools can go really far for you. And so a lot of mine might look really dirty, but they're not. They actually are clean. I just basically allow them to get a little bit stained by some of the colors. And that's just kind of how it goes. So I'm just going to come back in with a little bit of that phthalo. And the larger brushes give you a little bit smoother blend, and they also have a little less of the Pan Pastels on the brush. So that kind of gives you an advantage as well too, where you can just add layer on layer of color and play with it a little bit and then adjust it. I find that I like using the Pan Pastels more in layers and just using the Spectrafix. The Spectrafix dries really quickly, and it's just a really great choice when you're trying to do this type of work. I find that I prefer this over a workable fixative or anything else. I find workable fixative, I usually get spots and splotches on my pieces, and I really do not like how it looks. And it basically darkens everything so much that I have to add so many extra layers. Well, the Spectrafix always stays the more consistent color that you put it on. And I feel like that's pretty good. So I'm going to spray this one as well, and then I'm going to come back. So now that I let this dry after spraying it, the color's really good. Still has a little bit of the shine from that medium. It's gonna be a bit coarse, it's gonna be a little bit harder to see, but I like the overall color, and I find that it really set really well. I would suggest doing a couple thinner layers over one thick layer. This one was one thick layer, so it took a little bit longer to dry. And you'll notice the stamping has now kind of fallen to the background. If you stick with the lighter colors and you let some more of that white show through, you're gonna get a lot more of that texture. But I wanted this to be very subtle texture, which is why I've kind of allowed it to stay a little bit more to the background. So just fussing cutting this out for my main project. I really liked how the Pan Pastels worked on the peony leaf as well as the peonies. And this is the thing, is we can make a choice whether or not we want all of these pieces together or if we want them separate. So what I've done is I'm actually taking this apart and I'm adding the leaves around the shape. And this is a personal choice. You could definitely leave all the leaves on. You can remove them. It really is up to you. I personally like it with the leaves out and about a little bit. And so what I'm going to do is just put a grouping there and a grouping there, because in that way, this kind of brings your eye down in that direction. And this is where you could make the choice. You could just put glue down for this, or you can pop a few of these things up just to give them a little bit more dimension. And I'm going to do a little bit of both. I'm going to add my leaves with pop dots. It's more just because of the fact that I'm not sure if I really want to use glue on this one. So I'm just going to use some of the pop dots and everything that I have. I just want enough adhesion that it stays down, but I don't need a huge amount of adhesion. And so some of these foam dots, and I'm just adding them to the back of my peony image. I just want this to have a little bit more height than the leaves, and just to try to make it look a little bit more dimensional on this project. You don't have to. A lot of times I just add glue, but sometimes it's nice, especially when you're adhering other layers on, just to add a little bit more height to your project. And so I'm going to finish up with a little bit of journaling. And this week I was thinking a lot about the idea of community. And some of this is I've started to find a little bit more community, and I'm going into a phase of life right now where I'm in a lot more different communities. Some of it's through church, some of it's just the teaching I'm doing, both for myself and for other organizations. And I'm just loving the fact that there is community. I really had the thought that community means we don't have to do life alone. Sometimes community is hard because sometimes people aren't always great to us, and sometimes we go through things. But I don't feel like that's a reason to not be in community. I think it's just trying to find the right community that you can find some care and you can feel really safe in that place. And community can be a hard thing because sometimes you go in with best intentions and things don't work out the way that you expect. And I know for myself, sometimes you just need to walk away for a while and then you're ready for community again at some point. But I don't think that means we should never have community. I think it's just being aware of what you need and making sure you take care of yourself as you're trying to find community. But I don't think we've ever been meant to do life alone. I just think as people, we are meant to find community with others. And sometimes that just takes time, and sometimes it's just finding those people. And I feel like I'm hitting a time where I have more community, where I've had years where I felt quite isolated and not as connected with others. And so it's a lot of effort. It takes a lot of time, but I really wanted to focus on the idea of community in this particular layout. And I'm just using a white paint pen for this. I was using my jelly pens, and I'm just finding the paint pen is working a little bit better. Would you find useful in the idea of community? Is that with people that you are related to, or is that just people that are in your life in general? I feel like community doesn't have to be just your family. I know a lot of people think of the family unit, but at the same time, community can be found anywhere. It can be amongst people who have the same interests as you. It can be with coworkers. It can be anywhere. I just think it's important that we all have people that we can turn to for advice, for encouragement, just for friendship. And sometimes that can be even found online. I have found that a lot of you who have been following and subscribing and commenting, I absolutely love that you are invested in what I'm doing here. And I'm just so glad to be able to call some of you my friends. And I'm thankful that we can do this journey together because art journaling is a really powerful thing. It can help us really discover about ourselves, and it can really help us find our own community. I think it's a really great way of just connecting with others just through art and through the process. I do some Zoom classes so that we can build that type of community. I limit them to about 12 people, and we do art, and I do teach a lesson every week. But what's nice about it, it's also an opportunity for us to talk to each other, check in, talk about things, and just talk about life. And every class comes with a bit of a self-care topic. And sometimes we talk through it, and sometimes I just kind of give it as an idea for you to be able to run with in the class. And I've just loved the community that I have found on Zoom with some of you. And if this is something you might be interested in, I'm doing a botanicals class starting the end of April. You can find all the information on my website, and I've included the link below in this video just so that you can find it. And I'll be doing that for the last week of April and for 5 weeks in May. And so I hope that you can maybe join me on a Tuesday night, especially if you're looking to find some other creative community. I've been so thankful for the students that I have online. They love to get together. They love to spend time doing art. And I just find it such a really fulfilling time for me as a creative, and being able to share with so much excitement about what I'm doing and having everyone else be able to do their own take on some of the projects that I'm doing. So I would love for you to join me for that class. And sometimes when you're using these white pens, you need to make sure you give them a good shake. As they get emptier, they do rattle a lot more, and they only hold so much paint. So if you find that all of a sudden you're going like, well, where did all the paint go? It's just because they only hold so much paint. It's the beauty of a paint marker, but it's definitely not the least expensive option. Getting a tube of paint and using a brush is usually the cheaper option, but it's a lot nicer to get the control with the paint pens. And I'm just going along, and I am just cleaning up my letters a little bit. If I'd been smart about this, I would have used a pencil and made sure everything was nice and even. But instead, I am just going to run with what it is. I didn't want to plan this out so perfectly. I wanted to have maybe a little bit more randomness in this. And by adding in the arches, it also helps this feel a lot more grounded into the image. Because it is touching the image, it definitely gives this a more grounded feel. So there's my completed journaling. So for me, I had community means that we do life together. We're not alone and we have each other. And that for me is a really powerful statement because I've realized just how much I am thankful for the people in my life that are part of my community. You'd be surprised how many people really care about you that you don't even realize care about you. And it's such a beautiful thing. And this is maybe a bit of a gratitude page, as well as a reminder to me about the importance of community. So I hope this is giving you some ideas on how you can use Watermark ink with your Pan Pastels. So you can add them so there's just little bits of detail like you have in the flower, or they can be quite bold like you do in the background. There's lots of options with this. And I really wanted to show you how to do it on both black paper and white paper, just to see all the different layers and techniques you can use with just Watermark ink and Pan Pastels. And if you've enjoyed this video, if you could like it, subscribe, and just hit that notification button so you don't miss out on any future videos. So if you're looking for another video about Pan Pastels, click here. This is one where I use Pan Pastels with mediums, and I would love for you to check out that next video. So I'll see you there.